Right, there we go. What an amateur. I can't even make up any excuse for that one. I forgot to plug. I forgot to plug my mic in. Right, there we go. Hopefully you can all hear me loud and clear now. As I was saying, we're going to go through tonight a bunch of your questions. I've got some great ones that have come in from many of you. The headline, I guess, from this, the title of the video is the wild predictions for 2020, which is one of the questions. We're going to start off with that. And as I promised you, I've got a special guest with me this week as well. So I asked you all, if you wanted to be part of this week's show, to drop me a message on Instagram or Twitter telling me why you'd like to be part of it. The person I'm about to introduce did this. He sent me this message on Instagram which says, I'd love to join you on your live stream, mainly because I've just finished my final 16th medical exam for this year of uni, and in my spare time I've been looking after my amazing girlfriend who's a frontline NHS professional. So basically, I'm dying to talk Formula One with someone, anyone, he says. So let me introduce, without any further ado, Dan. Here he is, Daniel. Say hello, everybody. This is Dan.
Hello.
Let me pop you on split screen. Here we go. So Dan has done a whole bunch of work in terms of, he's been an ambulance, have you been an ambulance driver or a medic on board an ambulance?
Emergency medical technician, I think is the official term.
Great title. And your other half on the front line of the NHS. So I imagine the last couple of months have been crazy busy for you in your household.
It has been crazy. There's a lot of people like us, and she's been an absolute inspiration to me. She's amazing. She does an amazing job every day. And yeah, I'm really proud to be a boyfriend.
Yeah, well, great. Good on her and good on the pair of you, and welcome along to the show. Now, you're an F1 fan, obviously, as to be part of this, but one of the reasons that I wanted to bring you on board was partly to say thank you, because you're a follower of my stuff on here, my channel and my socials, and also to say thank you to you and your girlfriend for your amazing work within the NHS as well. That's amazing. I'm sure everybody will echo that. But how long have you been a Formula One fan? Just give a very quick overview of how you got involved, who you follow, who you support.
I think the first F1 race I ever watched was Lewis Hamilton's clinching of the title, overtaking Glock on the last corner. That was the first race I ever watched, and I have to say it wasn't the best advert for the entire sport, particularly now, but I have to say that that's what got me hooked. Ever since then, I've watched it pretty regularly. I've been I'd say a mega fan for maybe 3 years, and I have to say that I follow mostly Danny Rick and Kimi, as they're the characters of the grid.
Very good. And you went to a Grand Prix for the first time last year?
I did. I went to Spa. I went to Spa last year. It was the first ever race I ever went to. I went with my mum because she's a big fan as well. She loves F1, perhaps more than me, maybe. So we went together and we had an amazing time. It was a crazy atmosphere. It was a very somber weekend as well, because it was the same weekend of the death of Antoine Hubert. So it had somber moments as well, but everyone handled themselves beautifully, I think, and it was a positive weekend overall, I think. So yeah, I was happy I was there and looking to go to another one maybe. We'll see.
Brilliant. Any particular ones you got in mind?
It's got to be Italy, hasn't it? It's got to be Monza.
Well, you may have more than one choice when it comes to Italy this year. There's still lots of debate about Mugello potentially, even maybe Imola coming onto the calendar. So there's a few good ones to pick from. But yeah, Imola's Monza is of course very special. But I wonder this year whether it would be just as special without fans in the place. The Tifosi add so much to that particular event, don't they?
I know, and I don't know how they're going to do it this season. I don't know if they're just going to do some fancy camera angles. I was watching a replay of last year's Austria's race, and I tried imagining the crowd not being there, and particularly with Austria, you usually have the Verstappen army, orange everywhere. And so I couldn't imagine it without the crowd, actually. I don't know how they're going to do it. I'm sure they'll do a good job, but a huge part of the weekend when I was there was the fans and was the atmosphere, and that's certainly something that's going to be lacking.
Absolutely. Right, stay there a moment, Dan. We will come back to you in a second, but I want to start off this evening by talking about, as you saw in the headline, the title of this video, as I popped up this afternoon, some wild predictions for 2020. And the reason that I want to do that is because, let me see, hang on, where is it? Because I have got this particular question from Alan Stewart. Now, Dan, I'll come to you in a moment and I'll get yours. And everybody at home, I'd love you to drop in your wild predictions for 2020 as well whilst we go through this, and we'll pick up on some of those in a moment. But Alan Stewart dropped this question in. He said, I'd love to get a wild F1 prediction from both of you for the season. Mine is that Williams will not finish last in the Constructors this year. Well, that was such a great question. I decided to make it the title of the video because I think we can have some fun with this. And this is going to be such a sort of slightly weird and different season. Then why can't we have wild predictions? I think there could be some wild goings on over the course of this season. So I'm going to drop a couple in right here. First one, I will say that I'm going to say Lance Stroll could win a race. Now, I'm sure half of you are rolling on the floor laughing, but come on, why not? That pink Mercedes, the Racing Point, looks like a very, very good car. Potentially even maybe third best, maybe even ahead of the Ferrari off the back of pre-season testing. So if we get some slightly unusual circumstances, and I mean, look at Austria, the weather forecast for Austria is proper up and down and all over the place. Why couldn't we get one of the Racing Points popping in an unlikely victory? And look, there's no reason it couldn't be Lance Stroll. So it may sound like a wild and crazy prediction, but that's exactly what this is. And the other one that I want to just pop out there and see what you all think of this is that Alfa Romeo will not finish the season with their current two drivers. Make of that what you will. I'm not saying that because I know any inside information. I'm saying that for a number of reasons. I think partly there's a high chance that a team, and it could be any team, and it could be more than one team, could end up with problems due to a positive COVID test at some point throughout the season and could lose a driver. With Alfa Romeo, as with some of the other teams, it could be one of their drivers, or if it's a Ferrari driver, there's a very high possibility that it'll be Giovinazzi that moves from Alfa Romeo to take the position at Ferrari, meaning then that Robert Kubica would come in and fill those shoes. So I think there's a number of various scenarios. Potentially, you know what Kimi's like. He will, if he gets to a point in the season when things get a bit tricky internally in terms of this whole testing process, and somebody goes down with the virus, he will not want to be messing about risking his own health for something that he thinks is not as important as the health of himself and his family. And, I could see a scenario where Kimi could potentially say, if things got to that point, I'm not racing this weekend. The risk's too high. I'm out of here. So I think there's a number of scenarios that could force a situation like that. But look, those are a couple. No real basis for any of those. They are wild, crazy predictions. But look, that is exactly what we were after. Dan, let's come to you and see what you've got. And then we'll move on to see what some of the people at home have said.
Yeah, I've got to say those are a couple of pretty good ones. I'm going to go right out there and say Alex Albon, first race winner of 2020.
Very good, yeah. Not out of the question.
Red Bull have the equipment. They have the equipment. They have the track record at the Red Bull Ring. Alex Albon isn't really touching Max Verstappen right now on quali pace, but you never know in the race. So that's my wild prediction. It theoretically can be done.
Absolutely, yeah. There's no reason at all why that couldn't happen. Let's just go through a couple of of what people are saying at home, because we've got some good ones coming in already. We've got Giovinazzi to win a wet race, says Polyglotuk. I could see Sebastian Vettel storming off before the end of the season. Toys out of the Ferrari pram, says Johnny O420. I mean, look, Sebastian Vettel's an interesting one. I've got another question coming up on Sebastian, so maybe we'll park that one for now. But I think there's a number of scenarios, given the unusual circumstances, the compressed season, and everything else that's going on within this Formula One bubble, that could start to push, I guess, test various temperaments within the paddock, let's say. Let's see. To the Games says his prediction is that Das is going to be a big fail. That's another one. Will we even see Das? Will Mercedes see the risk of a protest potentially unsettling a championship challenge be worth having it? Varun Sambi says silver cars won't dominate. I think we can probably say that's true, given today's news that the silver cars will no longer be silver, and we'll talk about that more in a moment too. Ken Anderson says George wins the title. George Russell. That certainly would be a wild prediction, but never know. McLaren third, says Dylan Wheater. That would be amazing, wouldn't it, for McLaren to do that in their final year with Renault? I'm not sure, but you never know. And Alonso called in for Renault and wins a race, says Dave Bailey. How about that? If they had to call on Fernando Alonso and he came back in, stepped back into Formula One and smashed it onto the top step of the podium, wouldn't that be great? All right, one more of these and then we'll move on to the next one. We're going to say, let's go... Eric Kay says Kimi wins races. I mean, it's unlikely. Not, mostly that's unlikely because if you go off the form from pre-season testing, which is all we've got right now to base anything on, in reality, the Alfa Romeo didn't look strong. It looked like they struggled. They're in a sort of fairly dire financial situation, so I don't expect a huge amount of development on that front. But you never know. He's one of those guys that could be there to pick up something if everything else falls apart around him. So you never know. Right, let's move on to the next question. And that comes from, bear with me, let me find the next question. The next one will be from Toka Racer, who says this. He says, why is the Williams screen and steering wheel different? Right, I'm going to answer that one because I think I know the answer, and I've got a picture here to show you what I'm talking about. That there is the Williams steering wheel, very different to the way you'll be familiar with most steering wheels. Let me say that is, hang on, sorry, you know what I'm like with this technical stuff. There we go. That there is what most people will be familiar with the screen part, the dash display, the driver display built into the steering wheel, and yet Williams have that set up. So the steering wheel very, very different. The dash display mounted ahead of the steering wheel on the front of the opening of the chassis. Now, the reason that they've done this is, at least in part, and this probably stems from a previous driver's preference on this one, is that a previous driver will have expressed a desire to, first of all, maybe he prefers the vision of the screen being in a static situation so that he doesn't have to be constantly looking at information that's turning on an angle or shift lights that are moving with the steering wheel. But secondly, with the steering wheel in that configuration that Williams have it without the screen inbuilt, it's much lighter, or it is lighter. I wouldn't say it's much lighter, it is lighter. And on that basis, you get less resistance to a change in inertia. So essentially it's quicker, it's easier to change the steering direction more quickly. The steering becomes lighter with that Williams setup, and that potentially can be an advantage. I mean, you can exaggerate it and imagine if your steering wheel at home on your car, if you mounted a sort of, weightlifter's dumbbell on the front of your steering wheel and then tried to turn it very quickly, it would be much harder to build up that momentum to affect the change in steering direction. So when you shrink that down, it will have an impact. The reason that most other teams don't do it is that they see that impact as being very, very small, almost negligible. And actually there's another downside, which is that if you're going through something like a 90-degree corner or 90-degree of steering angle, of course that screen, that driver display that's mounted on the front is obscured. So there are pros and cons to both, but the fact that I think Williams are the only team that run that setup tells you that most people don't think whatever benefits they see are worthwhile having, and I suspect it's a thing that's hung over from some previous driver's preference, and Williams have just continually stuck with it. Cheaper, says Christian Kaser. Yeah, it may well be cheaper to produce a steering wheel, but I don't really think that's the bigger problem here. I don't think that's the factor that has meant Williams for all these years have kept this kind of design, if we're honest. Right, let's get back to the questions. The next question comes from Taylor Walker, and I'm going to get Daniel, perhaps get you to have a look at this one. This one is Taylor Walker. He says, do you think that the conditions for this season... hang on, I've made it too small. I can't read it myself. Have you got that one there, Daniel? Taylor Walker's question. I can see it if your eyes can't adjust. There you go. Let's you read it out, mate.
Yeah, no problem. So from Taylor Walker, it says, do you think the conditions for this season are right to see more midfield podiums? If so, which midfield team do you rate the highest going into the season? I hope you say Racing Point.
Okay, well, you can have first go answering that then, if you like.
Racing Point is my answer.
Great answer.
Incredible. Yeah, they looked incredible during the test. They're talking the talk. The car looks great. Why not? I think they are going to be the ones to beat in the midfield and perhaps even challenge Ferrari.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Personally, I think that's exactly the same kind of answer that I would have given. I think Racing Point, to me, don't look, and as I say, we're basing everything off pre-season testing, which was a long time ago, and some of the teams will have taken steps forward, albeit not to the same level we would have normally seen between March and where are we now, almost in July. But they would have taken steps forward, and the bigger teams have the bigger advantage when it comes to doing that. They have the bigger resources, the bigger capability to do things like that. So that's the first thing. But I do think Racing Point, off the back of pre-season testing, by far looked stronger than anyone else in the midfield. And I think that, you know, we might find ourselves not necessarily talking about them as a midfield team, but maybe talking about them as joining that front three and making it a front four. I expect Ferrari to have made some gains, given they've had a long period of time. You know, they are one of the biggest and most well-funded teams, so they've had the bigger opportunity to make changes and catch up, if you like, knowing that they had problems back in March. But I do think that Racing Point have a great opportunity. I think when you look beyond them, I think McLaren are obviously on a great trajectory. They've been improving over time. I think they've got this slight issue in that they've now announced they're moving from Renault to Mercedes, and now at least a part of their focus will be on integrating that Mercedes power unit into what will be this year's chassis, but into next year's car, because we know they're carrying that over. So there'll be some of their resource having to be put onto that. And also, Renault are likely to start, I don't think they're going to start really impacting McLaren in a really negative way, but they will start holding some stuff back in that, yes, they want McLaren to do well because it reflects well on Renault, but their main priority has to be their own Renault team. And I think given that McLaren are leaving them, almost all priority will be thrown into Renault's factory team. So we'll have to see how McLaren fare through all of that. But interesting point. Let's have a look at the next question, which comes from, this one comes from Imausery. This was on YouTube, I think. This one, he says, what do you think of Red Bull's update show at the filming day? Do they seem like they pack a punch? Let's see. Red Bull's filming day, which they ran at Silverstone with the current car. So unlike some of the other teams who ran unrestricted laps with an old car, 2-year-old car, Red Bull chose to run the current car for their 100 kilometres that they're allowed for filming day. One of the things that we were able to see on that car from some of the pictures that came out, in fact I think I've got one here, was some additions to the Red Bull floor. There you go, that is what was on the side of the Red Bull floor that wasn't there before that. That is some little strakes, some little vertical strakes, and in fact if I show you this picture here, you might get a slightly better view. Little vertical pieces stuck on the side of the floor that certainly weren't there back in testing. That's obviously an area of development they've been working on, and what they all are there for is to help shape the airflow around, particularly around that rear tyre. So that's about taking away the messy, turbulent wake around the rear tyre, but also start helping to take away what we call the tyre squirt, which is the squirt that can squirt out in all directions when the rotating tyre hits the racetrack. A large part of that tyre squirt that squirts out parallel to the tyre can go underneath the car, and there's a lot of work on the rear of the floor with the slots, and these fins will feed into those slots to help protect that diffuser and guide that tyre squirt, if you like, seal off the diffuser from that tyre squirt. And the outward shaping of those, as you can see there, is just to really guide the flow out and around the rear tyre to stop it just impacting it and becoming really turbulent and therefore really draggy. So it's all about drag resistance and shaping that flow around the tyres. The tyres on a Formula One car are an aerodynamicist's worst nightmare, because unlike most pieces on the car that are fixed and in a fixed and controlled position, of course the tyres are constantly squishing up and down over bumps, they're constantly rotating, they're bouncing around with the suspension. On the front end, of course, they're rotating as well. So they really are the hardest part for an aerodynamicist's perspective to be able to deal with. And this is just another way of trying to improve that flow around there. So that's what they're for. That's why they appeared. I mean, the question says, do you think they'll pack a punch? There's not really any way of knowing from our perspective how effective they're going to be yet. Red Bull will have got some data from that, and that's one of the reasons that they will have chosen to run the current car around Silverstone rather than an older car, because they can get some really feasible and valuable data from developments like this. So interesting that they've chosen to go that way, whereas some others haven't. Right. Daniel, let's bring you back, and I'm going to find the next question, which comes from Alex Cotman. Have you got that one there?
Alex Cotman. Yes, I do. What do you think of Mercedes' new livery for the 2020 season? Ooh.
Okay. Right. Well, this has been a massive talking point today. In fact, I've spent half of today arguing with people on Twitter, fighting on people on Twitter, agreeing with people on Twitter. It's generated discussion, which is great. It's what we're all about here, is generating discussion around these topics. First of all, let's look at the car from a design perspective. I've got a picture of it in case you haven't seen it. I'm sure most people have. Dan, have you seen it yet?
I have seen it, yes.
And here it is on the screen now. So whilst we look at that, tell us what your thoughts from a design perspective were. Do you like the look of it?
From a design perspective, I think it's an improvement. I do like Mercedes in silver. I think silver looks great. But from a design perspective, I think black looks better on that car. Particularly with the Ineos colouring, I don't think it went very well with the silver on the previous car. I think it blends with the Ineos a lot better. They've got the Kimi red star still on the side. It looks really smart. It looks really good. It looks like a testing livery, and I love testing liveries. Red Bull
the Niki Lauda star, you mean, yeah?
Yes, the Kimi star. Yeah, that's right.
Niki, yeah. I was really pleased to see that they've kept that. Somebody asked me actually earlier whether they had kept that, and if you look really closely, it is definitely there. I suspect that'll be one of those things that will remain on the car now for the team's future, and rightly so. So that's great. And I've got to say, I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you on that one, Dan. I think it looks really great. I think it looks stunning. It's a striking car now, and I think you're absolutely right. There'll be some of their sponsors that I think will be particularly pleased with the way that that's turned out, because their own logos do stand out and look better from that perspective. So I think it's a winner. I'd love to see them keep it, because beyond this season, because I actually think it looks great. But they are the silver arrows, so I suspect they will come back. But let's talk about quickly the reason why it's there. And somebody said to me, look, how could a silver arrow not be silver? Well, the point of all of this, of course, is to raise awareness behind the subjects that they're raising awareness for, which is inclusivity, which is equality, which is anti-racism and anti-discrimination. The fact that the famous silver arrows have now gone black does exactly what it's designed to do. It has an impact. It gets people talking about it, and it raises awareness. So from that perspective, I think it's a hit all round. I'm really pleased that they've done it. And I know this is a controversial subject and lots of people have differing views. But look, I take my hat off, or I would do if my hair wasn't so ridiculously stupid in lockdown. I take my hat off to everybody that's getting behind this cause right now. And I know that there are lots of other causes that need attention too, and they should rightly get it. But this is the cause that we're backing at the moment. And I think that Mercedes have done exactly the right thing here. So hats off to them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. I couldn't agree more. I think it sends a powerful message. I think it sends an important message. This movement isn't going anywhere. It's here to stay. We're going to talk about it. And it's not just the car they're changing. They're committing to increase the diversity of their own organisation. And that starts at the very top, at the top of the sport. Mercedes, I think, have earned the title of being top of F1 at the moment. So it's a great example to set. And it was very welcome news to see this today.
Couldn't agree more. Right, next question comes from Xavier Rogan, who says, how awkward will it be for Vettel when joining the Ferrari garage again this weekend? How do you think he's going to go? How do you think he'll go? and how will it affect the performance? That is quite an interesting one. I'm going to let you have an opinion on that one first, Dan. Sebastian Vettel, who has already announced, of course, that he's leaving Ferrari at the end of this season. What's gone on there, but how awkward will it be for him walking back into that Ferrari garage?
I don't think it'll be awkward at all. From what I can tell from Sebastian, he's a professional. He's very experienced. He's known these people for years. And I really think that he'll be able to have no problem creating a professional atmosphere to get the job done, because that's what everyone there is to do, is do a good job and get the job done. However, I do feel Sebastian can get inside his head sometimes. He can get inside his own head. And if he gets inside his own head, then things can go wrong, and he can start making errors on track. We see that. We've seen that in the past from him. It's not unusual. If he can maintain discipline, I think he should be fine.
Yeah, I don't think I could disagree with that. I think you're right in terms of the professionalism. It should be absolutely fine. I don't think there'll be awkwardness. And don't forget, of course, they have already done some time around Mugello recently. So actually, he's been back into the garage, albeit on a slightly smaller scale than a Grand Prix weekend. But I think you're right. What's going to really affect how awkward this season becomes for Sebastian is how results play out. Because if he starts to get beaten by his young teammate, who is the future, we know, of Ferrari, how much are Ferrari going to start favouring Charles Leclerc? How much are they going to start putting strategy his way, putting components if they end up being limited on certain components? How much is the focus going to start moving towards Charles Leclerc, given that he's the future of the team? And if that were to happen, and let's be clear, I only think that will happen if the results dictate that. I don't think that Ferrari in any way are going to deliberately go to hamper Sebastian Vettel. If he's looking great to win a race, they will love it if he wins a Grand Prix. You know, they will love Sebastian to go out on a high, to end his career at the red team in a great way. But if it doesn't go well, and just like Dan said, when things start to mess with his own mind, who knows what fireworks could happen then, and that's when things could really start becoming awkward. So I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there. Sebastian's one of these characters that we've already seen a few times. Things can start to twist with him over the course of a season, depending on how results go, how he thinks he might be being fairly treated by the race stewards, for example, or by other race drivers. He's an emotional character, and he doesn't hold that back when that happens. So that's something that perhaps as race fans we'll all look forward to seeing play out. Right, let's see what some people are saying here. I'm just going to bring up the chat again. Bear with me. So we have got Vettel is the unofficial number 2 in the team, says Jan Vides. Well, see, that's an interesting one. Unofficial number 2. Obviously, long term, I mean, that's difficult to disagree with. He's taking the back seat because he won't be there beyond this year. But in terms of this year, I really don't think Ferrari will deliberately set out to make Sebastian a number 2. I think the right thing to do, and I do believe this is what Ferrari will do, is to judge it on results. I mean, let's face it, if Sebastian ends up being the dominant character in that team when it comes to race results, they will start to put everything behind them. They're not going to jeopardise their own championship because they don't want Sebastian to win races or to win the title himself. I don't think it's going to come to that, but that's not the way that any team would operate. So I genuinely believe that they will throw their weight behind whoever has the best opportunity at either winning a championship or getting the best result on the day, rather than starting to deliberately make somebody a number 2 because he's leaving. I don't think Ferrari would operate like that. And I know that sounds crazy because of all the history that Ferrari have of number 1s and number 2s, but I don't think they will treat Sebastian in that way in his final year. Alex Lamas says, what about the new Williams livery? Well, Dan, have you seen that one yesterday? I haven't got a picture of that one, but
yes.
What are your thoughts on the Williams livery?
Again, an improvement. I prefer the change. I do, and I think it's also improved the driver overalls as well. I think the shift around of the sponsors, Lavazza coffee, I think it just looks tidier and neater and a little cleaner, and I really do like it. I think it's a great improvement and a nice throwback to their old colours as well.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with you again. I think I thought it looks really slick. It looked a bit. I think it looked a little bit too. And this sounds crazy, but over-sponsored. It looked like someone had shot it with a sponsorship shotgun, and they're just stickers and colours gone everywhere before. But I think now it looks really slick. It looks smart. Ultimately, it will only look good if it's fast, like every racing car, which we will have to wait and see on that one. It looks like they've made some improvements over last year, but how far up the table they think they can go is another story altogether. Let's see, Shane Dunn says it's a bit lacking in sponsorship, the Williams. Well, that's just a factor of Williams' current situation, isn't it? They have lost a title sponsor. They've sort of shared that space out amongst other sponsors that were already existing. So they haven't gained a major new sponsor to replace Rocket that, of course, have left. So they do have a gaping hole there. Some people saying Williams looks bland. I mean, that's another interesting opinion. It could be bland or it could be slick, whichever way you look at it. Nice and clean for Williams, but no sponsors, says Cosmos 2017. Let's see. So Lenny B says, can Red Bull get an advantage by having two teams when the budget caps kick in? Can they outsource some car development to AlphaTauri? That's a great question. Actually, loads of people have already asked me this on Twitter and Instagram. And it's actually an ongoing question that's being debated amongst the teams and the FIA and Formula One about how we police that kind of thing. There are a couple of things. So first of all, if you're an AlphaTauri, for example, you do have to, a little bit like Racing Point have had to do to the FIA, you have to prove that you have the design of your car, the design of your car has been bespoke to you. You have done the design work, and it's not just you've taken someone else's work. So like Racing Point have had to do, although they have worked very closely from photos and images of that Mercedes from last year, they have designed their own car, and they've got the design work to prove all that. They've got the whole development program that they can show. So AlphaTauri or anyone else would still have to do that, go through that process. They have to design their own car outside of the listed parts that you are able to purchase from a parent team, if you like. But on the other hand, is there scope for somebody to flout the rules or to bend the rules or to work loopholes in the rules where some R&D work, for example, at one team could actually benefit another team? So could AlphaTauri, could they do some R&D work somewhere in their factory, whether it's sort of some kind of stress testing or wind tunnel testing or whatever it might be? Could they do that and actually it be somehow covertly there to benefit the main Red Bull team? And lots of people in the sport think there may well still be loopholes that could be exploited in that way. So the reason that's a hot topic right now is there are discussions going on around how they close those loopholes. How can they put lines in the wording of the regulations to make sure that can't happen? But it's a really interesting point. There's going to be some really interesting stuff. Daniel, I'll bring you in for this one, because with this new set of regulations, I mean, it's 2022, although some things like the cost cap, for example, coming in next year, there are going to be a whole lot more. There's going to be a whole lot more that has to be policed, isn't there? And then we know what Formula One teams are like in trying to find any loophole, any advantage they can. Even when it comes to things like cost caps, there could be some very clever accounting going on. And when it comes to things like that, the cost cap in terms of what you can spend on your own car, like I've just described there, there's a whole minefield for the rule makers to now start having to go around plugging all of these holes in the regulations, isn't there?
Absolutely. I think you'll probably agree with this, is that when Formula One teams are presented with rules, they're presented with a challenge. And that challenge is, how do I get around this rule? And this has made everything way more complicated. It's you open, one door closes and several windows have opened for these F1 teams. They're going to find a way to do it, whether they do it at a very large scale or if they just manage a couple of, it makes a small difference. We're not really going to know. But like you said, they're going to be looking for loopholes, and it's up to F1 to be putting out fires left, right and centre as quickly as possible to make sure that things are fair for everybody.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think it's going to be a really interesting time, actually. You're going to start to see, what morals Formula One teams have. And there's a big discussion right now about teams doing the right thing for the sport over and above what's right for them. The cost cap's been a perfect example of that. Ferrari and Mercedes and co have voted here for something that doesn't benefit them in any way. This cost cap is losing an advantage that they previously had, but if you believe the wording of their press releases, they've done it for the good of the sport. How far will that go though? How long will this great positive mood that's sweeping through the world and Formula One and at times, how far will that carry? Because at the end of the day, once we go racing, it's going to be about getting results, and you get results by maximising every single possibility you can, every single loophole that's there to be exploited. You've got to exploit. It's your duty as a Formula One team to go ahead and exploit those. So really interesting. I think that's going to be to follow over the next couple of years. Let's bring in the next question, which comes from Luca56. Sorry, it's not my eyes ago. I'm not getting that old. It's just that because I've got it minimised on a small screen, it's tiny. But Luca56 says, who do you think will benefit the most or have been disadvantaged the least by this long break? And that's quite an interesting one. Typically, you would always say that whenever there's a change to anything that's normal, or a change to any existing layout or plans or technology, the big teams that have the biggest resource will always have the biggest advantage in this. But I think in this situation, given that we've had a break, and actually a large part of that break has been restricted in that factories have been on lockdown for a much longer period than we would normally have had, and therefore very little work has actually been able to have been done in that sense. This is actually much more, it's been thinking time rather than manufacturing time or designing time in that sense. It's been thinking time. So if you've had problems, and I'm going to refer back to Ferrari here, pre-season testing, Ferrari probably were the biggest and most well-funded team that had problems. You know, they weren't quick, they were slow in a straight line, they were nowhere near where they left off last year. They'd taken a step backwards, and you can look at all sorts of reasons for that with their engine controversy and everything else. But given that they were off the pace and now had a really long gap before we go racing, I'm going to say it's them that's had the biggest opportunity to perhaps work out where their deficiencies are and spend what money they have to be able to overcome them. Dan, any thoughts on that? Who do you think might have benefited from the gap? And perhaps if you're not sure about that one, who would you like to have seen benefit most from the gap?
Well, I'm not sure who I would have liked to have seen benefited, but I can say this is a complicated one because teams are all over the world. I think the vast majority of F1 teams are UK based. So the handicap of having a lockdown factory was synchronized for the majority of teams. So although, like you quite rightly said, bigger teams tend to do better because they have more resources, especially during these long breaks. However, since everyone has received the same handicap, there could be a sort of an even handicap, perhaps should we say, for the UK-based teams in particular. We don't know about Ferrari. They're based in Italy. I know that they were affected earlier by the pandemic, and whether they are still being affected now, I'm not sure. It'll be interesting to see what the teams have to say about this, and if they start using that as an excuse. I doubt they will. I think what they'll just be doing is do all their talking out on track. We will see who has been doing their homework over this break when lights go out in Austria.
And I guess as a Danny Ric fan, you're hoping that Renault have taken a step, because they perhaps didn't look greatest of the midfield bunch in pre-season testing. So perhaps they have taken some giant leaps.
Yeah, I like seeing Danny Ric do well. I like him a lot. We share a name. It's pretty much where the similarities end. However, I like to see him do well. I think when you say who's benefited, who's disadvantaged, let's talk about individuals. Daniel Ricciardo did say that he's managed to extend his career because of this break. He's been able to make himself stronger with his trainer, locked away in Perth somewhere at a remote farm, training with his PT. And he says because of that, he'll probably be able to go on for a couple of extra years. So we've got a few extra years of Danny Ric. What's wrong with that?
That's actually a really good point. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, we talk so much, don't we, about drivers experiencing burnout and teams experiencing burnout with the hectic schedule. We were about to embark on Formula One's longest ever season, let's not forget, and the talk of it even getting longer. And yet what we've ended up with is probably F1's shortest ever season and an enormous break. So the likes of the older drivers, and you might start to include Lewis Hamilton in that, 6-time world champion, but probably coming towards the latter stages of his career, has had an enormous break. And knowing what I know about Lewis, he will have not been sat there wasting that break away. He also is another one that says he's now stronger than ever, he's readier than ever, fitter than ever. So it's going to be actually really interesting to see how the drivers, as well as the teams, have dealt with the break. Because, you know, when you're in a team, there's this huge group of hundreds and hundreds of people, of course. There's structures, there's procedures, everything's kind of regimented. As a driver, you're kind of in charge of your own training regime. There's nobody there. The team are not there saying, right, I want you training Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You know, you can have Thursday off. I want you back on Friday. It's up to the drivers, along with their own personal trainers, to deal with that, which takes a huge amount of personal self-sacrifice and self-discipline. But it's going to be interesting to see who comes out of this perhaps best prepared mentally and physically, having dealt with that time. I would say that probably for those who were kind of perhaps expecting Lewis domination in 2020, I think this will have only helped Lewis in that sense, because he just does not sit there wasting time. He uses it efficiently and effectively. So that's an interesting point about the drivers. Absolutely fascinating to see how they've all developed over that time off. I've just been looking at some of the questions, Dan, and really rather importantly, someone has just pointed out that plant behind you might need a little drink of water.
That's Basil. It's really hard to get that. It's really hard to keep Basil looking healthy. But I can assure you, it's perfectly healthy. I'll be making some pesto tomorrow, and I assure you, it will be put to use.
Right. Let me see what other questions we've got coming in. Here we go. So Tuber Guy says, true innovation will be when a team brings in a new concept or solution without spending extra dollars, but rather doing it within the budget, throwing more money. I think he didn't quite finish his problem there, but that finishes his question. But that's actually a really good point there. The innovation is going to be when we get into a budget cap situation. I've been saying this for some time now. I really would love to see some of the technical regulations just opened up and released back to the teams now that we're going to be into a budget restriction, because a lot of those technical restrictions were put in place to stop teams spending ridiculous amounts of money. So if we've got a budget cap in place to stop that happening, let's let the engineers go crazy with some innovations and developments. I'd love to see what comes out of that. It's a really good point from Tuber Guy, that innovation, given that we've got a cost cap, actually can be even more impressive, because teams will have to be clever about how they do it. Everyone's got the same limit, so it then becomes about the engineering and innovative minds that we have in the world of Formula One. So I'm, being a technical person in that sense myself, I really would love to see the technical handcuffs taken off from much of the teams when we get into this budget restriction next year. That'd be great. Have you got any particular favourite technical developments over the years, Dan, that you've loved? I mean, I got into Formula One, I'm definitely not this old, let me just make this clear, but after seeing the sort of six-wheeled Tyrrell and the Brabham with a giant fan on the back, way back long before my time, I will point out. But I remember seeing photos of them and it really intriguing me. Of course, we had DAS in pre-season testing that fascinated a lot of people, but anything like that that's really caught your imagination as a relatively new Formula One fan?
I have to say I'm enjoying DAS. I really want to see it used. I really want to see what difference it makes. I don't want it to be overpowered. I don't want it to send Mercedes shooting off into the atmosphere. But I do want to see. I want to see it allowed, and I want to see what it does. I have to say I think my favourite historical development has to be the fan car. The fan car, that really, I remember it being explained on the Beyond the Grid podcast. How they came up with it and how it was conceived and how it was just sort of this mad idea that just worked, and it's one of those things you just kind of have to dream up something crazy to find something new. So that I'd have to say is my absolute favourite, I think. But I want to see DAS now. We're in 2020 now. I want to see what that does and what difference that can make.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm just going to bring in one more question, a couple more questions maybe. We're running out of time now, but I'm just going to bring in this one, which comes from Ash. Hang on, where is it? I've lost it again. Ash Domenico, I think that says, Doronenko. Do you think that the Austria round 1 will be a bit more of a mixed up race and round 2 will be more of a traditional race? And do you think we'll see 2 different winners or the same driver winning both? Daniel, let's ask you on that one first of all. We've got 2 races at the same circuit. Are we going to get exactly the same results? We're not seeing anything like we see at Silverstone where we've got a different tyre selection, or what like we might see in Bahrain where we can use a different circuit layout. Same tyres, same cars, same drivers, same track layout. Will we get the same result 2 weeks on the trot?
I really, really, really hope not. That would be rubbish. I really, really hope we get something different. And when they first said they were going to do 2 races at the same track back to back, I thought, oh no, we're going to get the same result. It's going to be a practice for Mercedes or Red Bull, and they're just going to perfect it in the second race, and it's going to be a stale grid for qualifying, and it's going to be a stale race. However, I see a bright light at the end of this possible dark tunnel, and that is that. Have you ever watched a Formula One race and asked, what if that didn't happen? What if this driver didn't spin, or this driver's MGUK didn't fry, or what if they didn't make a mistake, or what would happen if these 2 drivers came together for a fight once again? And we're going to get that. We're going to get a race where you get to try it again. And so I'm looking at it from that perspective. I'm looking at it from a positive perspective. I just sincerely hope we get some action in the first race. That means in the second race, there'll be something to talk about and something to look out for.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, the whole what if argument is exactly what a lot of people do say after a race, and we will get to see that play out. I mean, my take on that is that the first race in Austria, I think is prone to, or could be prone to, accidents, or not in terms of crashes, but I mean in terms of mix-ups and people getting procedures wrong, things, you know, strategy being called slightly wrong, drivers maybe making mistakes, pit stops potentially going wrong because of the lack of preparation, relatively speaking, that teams have had. And what I'm talking about that really is lots of people have focused on how drivers will get back in the car and within a couple of laps they'll be fully up to speed, and I absolutely know that they will be. Mostly the teams will do pretty much the same thing. But what happens, and I know this from experience, is that when you get a situation in a Grand Prix weekend that's one of the more or the less common situations. Let's say we get a red flag, for example, halfway through the first Austrian Grand Prix because of weather. It's those procedures that people are not familiar with and may not have had the same level of practice, may not have done it for well over a year or more. Now, it's those kind of situations that could end up catching teams out when they have to go to a certain mode on the steering wheel, for example, when the team call to the driver to say, right, we need you to go to this mode, and yet the driver hasn't done that for 2 years because it hasn't cropped up before. It might be those things that cause a little trip up somewhere that could cause problems. So I think the first Austrian Grand Prix could be there for mistakes to creep in, and we might get something a little bit less predictable. The second one, I actually think, will be a much more predictable Grand Prix. Now, whether that's the same result as the first, not necessarily, because of everything I've just described about the first race. But I think in terms of the second one, I think everybody will have all of the data that they could ever want about going to a Grand Prix circuit. They have all of the experience, having just done it the week before. They will know what mistakes they made previously. They will learn from those, and they won't let them happen a second time out. And so we might get what could be a really predictable race in terms of performance. So we might get the really true order, pecking order of teams in that way. But I don't necessarily think it'll be the same team or driver that wins because of perhaps the unpredictability of race one. And beyond that, of course, when we go to other double-header races, we are going to have a definite change with tyres and circuit layouts. And the other thing, of course, with Austria, have you seen the weather forecast, Dan? It's
no, I haven't. What's it looking like?
Oh man, it's thunderstorms, it's all sorts coming their way. So that's another thing that can spice up any Grand Prix. And I think particularly when we're talking about like we just said, 2 races that potentially could be a little predictable, chuck in some Austrian weather and it could really mix it up.
Absolutely. And I think if it's not going to be hot, I mean, I don't know if Mercedes have solve this heat problem at Austria. But if it's going to be cold weather, then more power to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they have solved the heat problem. I think that was a very much a sort of temporary problem that they realised very quickly. And on that subject, actually, because I've just seen the question whiz through from somebody, with the new black Mercedes car, somebody, in fact, lots of people have asked me today across social media, is that going to have an impact on cooling for the car? Because the colour of the car, of course, the black surface of that car could absorb much more of the sunlight and make the surface of the car hotter. And the answer to that one, in very brief terms, is yes, it does do that. So a black surface, of course, absorbs more heat, but it won't have it'll have a minimal effect on car cooling because of the sheer amounts of airflow that are passing underneath that bodywork through the different the cooling airflow over the different components that need cooling. So the surface of the bodywork may well get considerably hotter than it did when it was silver, but I think the components underneath, the critical components, will all be absolutely fine because the cooling flow path of the air will deal with that in the most efficient way possible. So I don't think it'll be a major concern for them. And of course, they will have already absolutely covered that before they signed off on the new livery, I'm sure. Right, let's see if there's a couple more questions in the chat here before we start to wrap up. Let me see what we've got here. It's just rain on Friday, it says at the moment. So if teams take a chance, quali would be fun on Saturday. Well, the thing about the Austrian hills is that it can change. It's a bit like Spa. I mean, you were in Spa last year, Dan. I can't remember what the weather was like last year. Was it good or was it terrible last year?
It was good weather. It was clear weather. It wasn't scorching hot, but it certainly wasn't cold or cloudy.
Okay, good. Well, in Austria, of course, it's very similar in that it's surrounded by hills, it's surrounded by forests. It can change in an instant, and the long-range forecast over this certainly over the first week, I haven't looked for the second week yet, is definitely changeable, and it can change so quickly. So I wouldn't bank on any weather being as it says on your apps right now, because it can change in a second. So Online Goldmine says, is the Honda engine on a par with the others? Well, it's definitely a lot closer, isn't it? I think it's one of those things that's impossible to know for sure, because only the people with the numbers can know, because you can only judge it off this, things like speeds of the car, which are also affected by aero and other factors. So we don't know, but they've taken huge gains. And let's just touch quickly on what we think Red Bull's hopes are when we're talking about Honda for Austria, because in fact, we'll finish on this one, Dan. I'll bring you in for a quick discussion on what we think might happen in terms of Red Bull, because lots of people, even after pre-season, thought Max Verstappen might be, or Red Bull might be, the closest to Mercedes, well ahead of Ferrari, ahead of Racing Point. Could it be the year that Max Verstappen potentially takes on Lewis Hamilton for a world championship? He could end up being the youngest ever Formula One world champion if he does it this year. What do you think? I mean, it's a circuit they've done very well at over the last couple of years. Honda, like that chap just mentioned, have taken giant leaps forward with their power unit. Is everything converging at the right moment for Max Verstappen, do you reckon?
I think so. I mean, I remember when Honda were first going to start supplying engines to McLaren, and then when they moved over to supplying engines to Toro Rosso, and they started supplying engines to the main Red Bull team. I personally predicted that the Honda engine was going to be powerful but unreliable, and oh, was I wrong. It was extremely reliable, and it had a decent bit of kick as well. And so I think with the engine and with the steps they're taking, it's a huge project over at Honda, that Max Verstappen is in the best position possible this season than ever before, and I cannot wait to see Lewis and Max battle it out.
Wouldn't it be great? And I think one of the biggest tells in all of this is you can judge pre-season testing, as we all do, but with a massive pinch of salt. But always look for what the drivers are saying in their post-test session interviews. And if you think back to how that was, and even how it's been since, the mood in that Red Bull camp is much more positive than I've ever seen it in recent years. And just the little nuggets of information that are coming out of quotes from drivers or from Christian Horner or even Helmut Marko about their chances. They are genuinely all talking about a championship challenge. Now, you don't do that unless you genuinely believe you're in with a shot. Otherwise, you look very, very silly. So I think this could be a really interesting season. I think it's going to be interesting on so many different levels. But I think at the very front, if we can get Verstappen versus Hamilton, my goodness, that's what we've been wanting for a long time, isn't it? And we've got this year and then potentially next year as well. Let's assume that that Lewis Hamilton stays, although yet to be signed, of course. But these are the last 2 years that we'll see the cars in this form, you know, this quick, with this type of aero in the current era, with these you know, current regulations, where the cars are this close, where Mercedes and Red Bull have over the years built up towards each other and converged to be the closest rivals, as it would appear. When we get to 2022, well, anything could happen, and we could get new favourites coming in, and any new team could end up being in a stronger position. But I think this year and next year could be fascinating to see those two going wheel to wheel. Let's hope it happens, and let's not write off the others. Let's not write off Valtteri Bottas 3.0, as I saw somebody put in the chat earlier. And of course, Alex Albon. Who knows? If their car is quick enough, any of those guys could be there ready to take a championship, certainly race wins, maybe even a championship. Before we go then, Dan, let's get you to stick your money where your mouth is. Who is going to win the 2020 World Championship?
Well, if I'm putting my money where my mouth is for real, I would say Lewis Hamilton is going to win the 2020 World Championship. He's got the machinery, he's got the right attitude, he's got the drive, he's got the talent, he's got the consistency. Things are looking good for Mercedes right now, and so I would be a fool to suggest anyone else, if I was putting cold hard cash on it, I would be a fool to say anybody else. However, I think it would be amazing to see somebody else really properly challenge for this title. So if we saw a Verstappen World Champion, a Leclerc World Champion, maybe even a Bottas World Champion, then you'll see a smile on my face, and I'll happily give my money away.
Yeah, fair point. I can't agree with you more about Lewis. I think he's got to be favourite, because at the moment all we've got to base things on is previous form and pre-season testing, and all of that points still towards Lewis Hamilton. But yeah, wouldn't it be great to see a close fight at the front? A couple of you just saying Max Verstappen. In fact, lots of you saying Max Verstappen for the 2020 champion. Lots of you saying Albon ahead of Bottas. Shane Dunn says that. Taffich says Hamilton 2020 champ. Verstappen 2020 says Cedric Franson. Max champ. Tiven 6666. So many of you, it looks to me like most people think it's going to be between those two. There's only one way to find out, and that is to watch the 2020 season, which starts, of course, in just a few days' time. How excited are you, Dan?
I cannot wait. I cannot wait. We've been without this sport for too long. It's about time.
Absolutely. Well, I think we all agree. And now, before we go, I just want to say a huge thanks to you, Dan. I really appreciate your time this evening. I know I dropped this on you without too much warning or without too much preparation, so really appreciate it. You've been fantastic. Thank you to everybody at home for watching, and for all your questions that have been coming in. Do keep them coming, and I'll try and answer as many as I can in the comments after we go off air too. But thank you very much, everybody. Just a few more days to wait. I'll be back this week with some more videos talking nonsense about Formula One. Let me know what you'd like to hear me talk about. I'll also be back later in the week with a preview, of course, to the Austrian Grand Prix, a technical preview. So keep an eye out on the channel for that. Dan, say goodbye to everybody.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, folks. See you later.